I'm delighted to welcome you to the first event in the Center for Diversity and Inclusion and Belonging speaker series. My name is Kenji Yoshino. I teach constitutional law here at the law school, and I'm also the director of the center. I want to begin by thanking the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network for co-sponsoring this event, as well as the student organization, Law Women. The Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network is a new initiative that just ginned up last year that aims to develop our students' leadership skills, nurture women's achievement at the law school, and engage the legal profession to better enable women lawyers to fulfill their potential. I'd also like to thank the sponsors of the Center's speaker series, and they are behind me, but just to reiterate, they are Cravath, Davis Polk, DLA Piper, Fried Frank, Kirkland and Ellis, Latham and Watkins, Paul Weiss, Wachtell Lipton, and White and Case. Now I'd like to introduce our two distinguished speakers. I'm delighted to first welcome Professor Melissa Murray as a permanent faculty member to the law school. Professor Murray comes to us from the University of California, Berkeley, where she was the acting dean. She is a renowned scholar in the areas of constitutional law, family law, criminal law, and reproductive rights and justice, focusing on the legal regulation of sex and sexuality. A graduate of Yale Law School, Professor Murray clerked for Sonia Sotomayor, then of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, and Stefan Underhill of the United States District Court for the District of Connecticut. We're absolutely thrilled that she's joined us at the law school. Professor Murray will be in conversation with Chai Feldblum, a commissioner of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Commissioner Feldblum graduated from Harvard Law School and clerked for Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun, as well as Judge Frank Coffin of the First Circuit Court of Appeals. Prior to her appointment to the EEOC, Commissioner Feldblum played a leading role in drafting and negotiating the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and the ADA Amendments Act of 2008. She helped draft the federal bill to protect LGBT people from discrimination and has led the EEOC in protecting LGBT individuals under existing sex discrimination law. Importantly, for today's session, Commissioner Feldblum recently co-chaired a select task force on the study of harassment in the workplace, which resulted in a comprehensive report issued in 2016 on harassment prevention. I should also say that Chai is a longtime friend and one of my heroes in the legal world for all of her incredible work, both with regard to legislation and litigation, and she's just everything you want a human being to be. Before I hand over to Professor Murray, I'll just mention the process for the audience Q&A component of this event. Instead of taking audience questions via microphone, we're going to do it by index card. So you will have picked up an index card on your way into a room, or you'll find one in your chair. Please write your question on your card as it comes to mind during the discussion. And helpers will come around during the Q&A to collect the cards, and Professor Murray will read out a selection from the pile when we get to the Q&A. So this is our attempt to be more inclusive and egalitarian in the way questions are asked, because we don't like the first past the post filibustering style of questioning, and so this is an attempt to circumvent that. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Murray and Commissioner Feldblum.
So I will also say I'm really delighted to be here with you today, and it's a real privilege and honor. So thanks for doing this and for being here and sharing your experiences with us today.
Thank you.
So we are almost a year away from the first anniversary of Me Too. Mm-hmm. So when you saw all of this unfolding in October of 2017, what were your thoughts sitting in your office in the EEOC?
Well, when we had issued the report in June 2016, that for us was about rebooting harassment prevention, like really to start doing things differently. I will tell you that if someone at that point had asked me, what's the biggest roadblock right now to making change? I probably would have said, getting people's attention. I will say that post Weinstein, post any other number of people, we now have the country's attention. The question is, what are we going to do with it now that we have that attention?
Right, so this issue was already on your agenda, and in a way, both the work of the EEOC and Me Too had already identified some lapse in the way harassment was addressed and whether it could be prevented. But you've taken two radically different paths to trying to address it. So the Me Too path might be described as extra legal, really relying on social media, elevating the voices of women who may not necessarily be legally trained, who may not have had a forum before to ventilate their concerns. And then the path that you have described in the 2016 report, which really focuses on beefing up compliance efforts in HR departments within institutions, but most importantly, I think, also cultivating a new kind of workplace culture that is rooted in norms of civility and respect as opposed to mere compliance. Right? Is the way in which you two might dovetail and you might bring some of the elements of Me Too into the work that you're doing in the harassment area?
Well, I think you've identified exactly sort of the two ways in which an entity, a government entity like EEOC, can try to make a difference, can intervene to stop harassment, and how those two potentially need to work together. So just to let you know how that task force came about, which met from about 2015 to 2016, I came on the commission in April 2010. I came on at the same time as a colleague of mine, Victoria Lipnick, who is one of the Republican commissioners. The EEOC is set up to be bipartisan. So no more than 3 of the commissioners out of the 5 can be of the same political party. So I was a shock, one of the Democratic commissioners. She was one of the Republican commissioners. But we worked together on any number of issues because we had a similar commitment to civil rights. Right? So we both starred, and she and I are both appalled after about 4 or 5 months of how much harassment was going on. And egregious harassment on all bases, sex and race and disability and age. And it was very clear we had a robust enforcement effort by the EEOC. And I'm proud of that enforcement effort. But that enforcement effort had been going on for lots of years, and we were not seeing change. So the point of the task force was to bring together a group of carefully selected people, and we spent 2 months gathering that group, a third folks representing employers, either themselves litigators or representing employer associations, a third representing employees, and a third academics. Because we wanted lawyers who don't often talk to each other than in a courtroom to have a safe space to think about the issues. And we wanted all of those lawyers to hear from academics who have been researching this for decades and learn from them. And the first thing we said to them, our first meeting was called Framing and Bonding. Right? And in the framing, we said, this task force is not about law. This task force is not what the EEOC should be doing in terms of enforcement. This task force is figuring out ways to stop harassment before it happens. In fact, it's about stopping bad conduct before it rises to the level of illegal harassment, before it's severe, before it's pervasive. So we want to come up with ideas that will help employers stop bad conduct. Now, how does the Me Too movement intersect with this? Attention, right? We put in the report, and what to me was the motto, even though we didn't discover it towards the end, was the quote from James Baldwin: "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." The people speaking up in the Me Too movement are putting forward the stories that people are now facing. but they're not the structural group that will help make the structural changes. That's why we have to be working, and I mean we as citizens in all the different dimensions that we work structurally in society, we have to work to leverage that power. We have to be working together.
So one thing that Me Too has also done beyond merely calling attention to it is also highlighting the degree to which so much of the problem is not necessarily about conduct that is clearly illegal, but conduct that lies in that gray area that's objectionable but not necessarily out of step with law. And this is something that the report really focuses on. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so the problem with law, as I say to our group of law students and law professors and law alums, is that it is often constrained by certain standards that don't seem to make gut sense sometimes, right? Something that should seem that is clearly wrong may not be held by a court to be illegal. I mean, sometimes, from my perspective, it's because the court is interpreting the law wrong. You know, a hostile work environment, something that I see as facts to me seem like it would be a hostile work environment. Some judge is saying it's not. And sometimes it's just that the law is creating a standard. There has to be a hostile work environment based on the conduct, right? So what we were trying to say in the report is that changing, stopping harassment requires changing workplace culture. That's where it has to start. And law is not necessarily the best mechanism for changing culture. It is, from my perspective, one essential element of changing culture because it can help change behavior. But it's only one. And if we are depending just on law, we're not going to get the success that we want.
So some critics would say that we have made this problem an exclusively legal problem. So my former colleague at Berkeley, Lauren Edelman, has written a book, Working Law. And she focuses on the fact that since the Civil Rights Act of 1964, most corporations have in place anti-discrimination policies, if not entire departments that are charged with dealing with discrimination problems, whether it's harassment or other forms of discrimination. And yet, we haven't seen a pickup in representation in the highest levels of organizations, and certainly we continue to see gaps in wages for women and minorities in these institutions. And she posits that what the legal interventions have done is provided a structure for compliance, but only symbolically. So managers know that they have to have these things in place, they put the legal policies in place, they create the departments, but they don't actually believe in it. They just have to have it there as a sort of cover your whatever in order to keep going. And you never really see that kind of cultural change. So the report is really intentional about the question of cultural change, but focuses on law. So what other elements besides these legal elements do you need in order to make this successful?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure that I would say that the report focuses on law, right, to make that culture change. It's coming from a legal enforcement agency, so I think it's almost coming from the fact that while we think law is necessary, it's just not going to be sufficient, right? So, and I read Lauren's pieces for the report. There is really a divide between, I just want to say on the side, between often law review articles, including very good ones that are written by, law school professors, and people in agencies or courts or just lawyers that actually could benefit from reading those, right? And I think there is something about the fact that I taught at Georgetown Law School for 18 years before I came to the commission that to me made it important to read pieces like Lauren's and Melissa's and Sylvia Law's and any number of others. So what she said, and is correct, is that a lot of employers put into place structures like training because the law was that if there was harassment that occurred on their watch in their workplace, if they could show they had taken reasonably preventive measures, then, and they had responded appropriately to a report of harassment, they weren't going to be liable for damages. So that's great incentive to take reasonably preventive measures, which translated into training. It didn't really translate into making sure your training worked, because that's not really something the judges were focused on. Same thing, diversity and inclusion. People were like, we expect you as a company to have diversity. And not just diversity, but also inclusion, that people feel safe once you've brought them in and included. But they'd have them, but they didn't necessarily believe in their guts. And when I say they, I mean the C-suite. If you're in a private sector, right, the executives on the nonprofit sector, right, the leaders. They didn't necessarily believe that it would really be better for the organization to have diversity. Well, we said, and this comes from the academic research, that to change workplace culture, which is not easy, but can be done if leaders act in a certain way. And it requires three things. First, the leaders have to actually believe in what they're trying to do. So let's say stopping harassment, they actually have to believe that harassment is wrong. Second, they have to articulate those values and expectations. Okay, do not underestimate the power of words. Do not underestimate the power of an all-staff meeting that's brought together for some corporation, and at the beginning of the meeting, the leader says, I want to remind you all about what's acceptable and not acceptable conduct in this workplace, and what will happen if we find unacceptable conduct on something that has nothing to do with it, right? And third, the leaders have to act in a way that employees believe they are authentic. Leaders say a lot of things. They have to act in a way that makes the employees think they mean what they say, either in stopping harassment or in having true diversity at all levels of an organization. They have to see by actions that the leaders are authentic. So let's just wrap around to the first one. They have to actually believe. I would hope that this moment, in terms of Me Too, in terms of people focusing on the fact that we don't want to just stop harassment based on sex, but on all bases, I'm sure we can talk a bit more about that. The people who actually believe it and have always believed it can feel, I want to step up to the plate. I want to give me the roadmap of what I should do. Mm-hmm. And maybe those who didn't really believe it in their gut before and maybe don't believe it now, let's just hope that the fear of being on the front of the New York Times might now make them want to take some of these other steps. But it's really not as good as actually believing it. And none of that has to do with law, right?
No.
But it's in the framework of law, right?
It's in the framework of law, but it really, I think it does require institutions to carefully examine their DNA. I mean, to be, we're going to be totally frank and honest, I've seen this up close, like during my time at Berkeley. When I was at Berkeley, at least for the last 2 years that I was there, the university was embroiled in a series of sexual harassment scandals, one of them involving the law school, quite notably. And what I thought was really interesting about the report is the report actually identifies 12 factors, the presence of which might indicate conditions in which harassment might occur, be cultivated, or even flourish, right? And a lot of these rang true for me thinking about Berkeley. So one of these factors is a homogeneous workforce, the presence of many young employees, and if you think about universities, graduate students, researchers, people like that, a decentralized management structure, a subset of high-value employees, significant power disparities between employees, a priority on client service or customer satisfaction, not necessarily relevant to Berkeley. Sorry.
But very important in the restaurant industry.
Yes, and monotonous or low-intensity tasks. And so a lot of these rang true for me, and I understand exactly what you were saying. But they also reminded me of other places I had worked. And when you read off that list, you've basically described a law firm.
Yes. I mean, hopefully not the monotonous work, but some of it will be.
So
I guess.
I think that's an interesting point for this particular audience. Is there something about the culture of legal work, whether it's in a big law firm or a small firm or in a nonprofit, because of the hierarchy of the work that we do and the culture that we have come up in, like law schools are incredibly hierarchical, are we creating and replicating a culture in which, despite our best intentions, we cannot actually break these patterns?
I think you can break the patterns. We wouldn't all be here, right, if we didn't think we could break the patterns. I'm sorry, I just had to say that. But it's not easy to break the pattern. It's just saying you have to, nothing can be changed until it is faced, right? But it can't be changed until it is faced. Not everything that's faced can be changed, right? But you have to face it. And what you're doing is highlighting the things we have to face in terms of the structural issues. So, you know, it was one of the plaintiff lawyers in our task force that literally at the first meeting said, you know what, if we really want to stop harassment before it happens, we should think about what are risk factors for harassment happening, right? And I will say you, there are a few, I think, unique contributions of the report, and this is one of them, of really researching what would be risk factors. Now, you read those, and it's basically almost every workplace has some components of them. The point about them was to say to someone at the top, if you care about stopping harassment, look to see which of these risk factors you have, and we have a chart at the end of the report, which really needs to be fleshed out, but it has the risk factor, it has why it's a risk factor. A lot of young employees, boy, that's a big thing for a power differential. And two, young folks often don't even know their rights. Hopefully that's not going to be the case for this audience when you go out, but it sure is for a lot of people starting out in their first jobs. So that's why, and what can you do, right? So like to just start thinking of some specific proactive activities, right? Decentralized workplaces, huge issue. You know, it doesn't matter how great the mama office is of some big corporation about how they don't want to stop harassment if that message isn't getting down to the managers in the 1,000 stores they have. Okay, what do you want to do about that? Well, let me tell you, one thing you do is, if there's some manager of one store that did not respond appropriately to harassment, dismissed it, you know, didn't deal with it, that manager gets disciplined, maybe fired, depending on the situation, and everyone else is told about that, okay? So there are things you can do. Now, to not have a homogeneous workplace, you gotta do a lot, and a lot more than what companies and organizations are doing now. And that has to be a slow and steady process about making sure you have diversity throughout the workplace, modes of advancement, promotion, but truly the research shows that if you have diversity on the higher levels, that helps change the workplace culture. So I want to say one last thing, as you mentioned in terms of Berkeley, et cetera.
I didn't mean to pick on Berkeley.
No, don't pick on Berkeley. And I've been so out of the academic world that I actually didn't even have any clue. But any event, but I do have a clue about a lot of other stories. What?
That's a lie.
So this is what we call in the report the problem of the superstar harasser, okay? And that's the person who's of high value to the organization for whatever reason. In some organizations, it's because he, and it's often a he, although not always, brings in a lot of money. Or it's a major scientist, you know, that's bringing in a lot of grants. Or it's someone who's famous, right, and brings in attention. And what happens is leaders have made the following cost-benefit analysis for years when people have brought allegations of that person is engaged in harassment. They decide that the cost of getting rid of that person is higher than the benefit of getting rid of the person, and so they pay off the person who complained, or they just get rid of that person. By the way, the research shows that keeping a toxic worker in the workplace, high level, or any level, is actually more costly in terms of adverse impact on productivity, turnover, et cetera. It's also adverse impact in reputation. And I think leaders of organizations are now beginning to see that they need to do a different cost-benefit analysis. But boy, I don't think that has taken hold completely at all. And let me tell you another superstar type person. Doesn't have to be someone at the high levels. It can be someone who's just a very good producer in a particular division, right? Producer on sales, producer on whatever you're producing in that organization, articles. And the manager who's being evaluated based on the output of the division, who's then told by someone who maybe he or she doesn't even like that much because he or she isn't producing that much, that this person has harassed her. They're like, they don't want to get rid of the top producer, regardless of the fact that that person's not highly visible. They'd much rather dismiss, trivialize, ultimately get rid of the person who has complained. We have to change that cost-benefit analysis. And again, I come back to accountability. We have to hold not only those who engage in harassment accountable, and that's in proportionate manner. Not everyone deserves to be fired, especially if you're trying to stop conduct at the lowest level. Okay, but not only those people have to be held accountable, but managers and supervisors who choose to protect, for example, their superstar, instead of biting the bullet, sending it up the line and getting rid of that person, that supervisor or manager, or dean if it's a dean, or whoever it is, that person must be held accountable. And that's very hard. But if we don't do that, we won't change that cost-benefit analysis.
The report is really clear about statistics, and some of the statistics are actually quite surprising. As you said, a huge volume of your docket at the EEOC is harassment cases. And of that group of harassment cases, the bulk of the harassment is sexual harassment or sex-based harassment. And you note in the report, people can be harassed along multiple axes of difference. So there are women who experience harassment on the basis of sex, but those women may also be African American and then experience racial discrimination or harassment that is race-based as well, or they may be lesbian, and then they are experiencing sexual orientation discrimination as well. And they are perhaps the most vulnerable because the law is not necessarily set up in a way that acknowledges that intersectionality, but rather looks for single and perhaps seriatim examples of discrimination. Can you say more about that and how a culture of civility in the workplace might do more to get at those kind of intersectional problems?
So there are a number of things packed into that.
Yes.
So
we're at the
which
end
is
of our
good.
time.
We wouldn't expect Professor Murray to ask anything other than interesting, complex questions, right?
And I only have 5 minutes, so I had to get them all in that one
Yeah.
question. So there was that.
But I'll be able to get at least some things, because I actually brought one piece of paper here about some statistics that I want to say the importance of discrimination on other bases, even when it's not an intersectional issue, okay? Because I'm telling you, thank goodness that the narratives about sexual harassment has caught the country's attention, but shame on us if we don't use this opportunity to make the structural changes in workplaces that will stop harassment on all bases that are protected. And here's why. Yes, we get a third of our charges, I'm just telling you from last fiscal year, 85,000 charges, a third of them were harassment charges, either solely harassment or harassment is one of the charges. The largest, yes, sex-based, 46%. But race-based, 34%, right close to that. Age, almost 20%. And I think that will increase as the workforce ages. Disability, 14%, national origin, 12%, religion, 5%. Okay? Harassment is happening on all these bases, and they're sometimes intersectional, and then the law has a difficulty with it. Sometimes they're not intersectional, right? It's just African American men and African American women are being harassed. And I will tell you, egregious. I mean, we have noose cases still. Nooses in workplaces. So, we have to make sure that we are stopping harassment on all these bases. Second, I want to say that although our charges overall in the first 3 quarters of FY17 compared to the first 3 quarters of FY18, I say fiscal year, government speak, our year goes from October 1 to September 30th. So the data I'm about to give you for FY 2018 is not yet validated. That is, they might change because we do a scrubbing of the data at the end. But you look at the first 3 quarters of FY17 and the first 3 quarters of FY18, our charges overall have dropped about 12%. And I think it's because of this public portal we've put in place that really helps screen the charges for people to know if they have a valid charge. Sex-based harassment charges are up 3.4%. So it's only a small percentage number, 325 more, but up 3.4%. And we've seen this with our state counterparts also. Their charges have decreased less, about 3%. They don't yet have this portal. Their sexual harassment charges increased by 24%. Again, it's a small number, 552, but it's still a significant increase. So we have harassment on all bases. We do see an increase in terms of sexual harassment charges, which, by the way, the reporting statistics you referenced, according to surveys, only 15% of people who experience harassment ever bring a legal charge. So 1/3 of our charges are harassment, and only 15% are ever coming to us in the first place. So one of the things we say in terms of training, for example, you have to have good compliance training, what we call training not to change people's mind, but to help them keep their job or not be disciplined on the job. It's like, you might think it's fine to say to Susan, oh, you look so sexy. The guy said, oh, what's the problem saying to Susan, she looks so sexy in that dress? I say it to my wife and she loves it. And you say in the training, fine, we're not here to change your mind. Go home and say that to your wife. You probably need to say it to more. But when you walk into the doors of this workplace, that's not okay. Okay, so that's very specific characteristic-based, protected characteristic-based training. But we think that just general respectful workplaces training can help as well. Respectful workplaces not based on any particular status. It's just making the case for the importance of a respectful workplace generally, and it's very skills-based training. It's giving people the skills on how to respond when they experience disrespectful behavior, which is not easy for people to know, especially with the power dynamics of a workplace. It's teaching people the skills that when someone says to them, that just made me uncomfortable, either because it was disrespectful or made me uncomfortable because you told me I looked sexy. Giving that person the skills of how to respond, because that's not human nature to know how to respond well. And by the way, also bystander intervention training. So someone else who sees it, who's in a different power status, can say something to the person in the moment, that makes me uncomfortable, or say something to the person afterwards, or just know who to go to help the target. Didn't I give a lot of answers to that question? Like everything I wanted to say?
It was an A+ answer.
Oh, well, thank you.
A+ answer.
Now you're going to get, so we still have our time for questions.
So we have audience questions, and David has them. While I sort through them, I have a question for you. So what about the detractors who say things like we are becoming overly obsessed with civility and we're verging on a culture of political correctness run amok?
Number one, in terms of political correctness, I think politics is really important because how else does a democracy work? And I think being correct is a really good thing, better than being incorrect. Putting that, so that's clearly a phrase that is used to, you know, as an argument for people to keep doing what they were doing before, which may not have been correct. Putting that aside. It's all depending on us, right? It's like we want to say, we want a culture of respect. A culture of respect doesn't mean that you can't have excited and engaged views and conversations, and it doesn't have to be dull. Respectful is not equivalent with dull and boring. It's just being respectful. And especially in workplaces where there's this power disparity, you know, some people, they're jerks, okay? They're just jerks. And then they're equal opportunity jerks. And it affects the culture of the workplace. Saying to that person, it's not disrespectful to say to someone, you got this in a week late, it's been the third time you've done that, that's not acceptable, we need to talk about that. Someone else might feel, you know, that they're bullied by that comment. They're not, okay? In case you ever want to know, that's not bullying, that's management, and hopefully good management, okay? But there are different ways in which you can say that to someone. And that's the point about being respectful. And one of the researchers said, who studies this, is really only one of two researchers, she said, uncivil behavior can be a gateway drug to illegal harassment. And that's how I think we need to think about it. Let's create that culture of respect. Let's teach people how to respond early on to low-level comments. And then the point is to make unwelcome, disrespectful behavior the outlier, right? It's like the anti-smoking campaign. It's like someone lights up in a place they shouldn't be lighting up. Like everyone sort of looks at them like, dude, you know? It's not what we do here. And that's just got to be the same in a workplace, even with the low-level comments. That are people like, hey, that's not us.
So the questions from the audience cluster around a number of themes. So there's a set about Me Too, specifically commenting on the movement, a set of more abstract questions about the larger project of changing workplace culture, and then some questions that are asking you to spill the tea about working with the Trump administration and the EEOC. So I'm going to start with those.
And only because Professor Murray is so good that she could just flip through those index cards and get her categories.
All right, so one asks, like, the EEOC is a bipartisan agency. What's it been like working with the Trump administration and its appointees?
Well, there's two ways in which a new administration can affect a commission. One is the majority of the commission is supposed to move so that the majority is of the party in power. That has not happened at the EEOC. So we have not, since January 20th, 2017, had a Republican majority because the two new Republican nominees have not been confirmed. So personally, inside the agency, there's really no change for us, and we are just proceeding ahead. I mean, I think elsewhere, I mean, it's been reported all over that the Department of Justice has a different position than the EEOC on whether sexual orientation and gender identity is a form of sex discrimination. I mean, so public that in a Second Circuit en banc here, you know, oral argument, you had both the EEOC and the Department of Justice arguing on opposite sides. So obviously—
Awkward, really
awkward.
Super awkward.
Awkward, which is exactly what the EEOC lawyer said when one of the judges said, this is sort of unusual. Like, can you explain this? And he literally said something like, well, yes, it's awkward. I think he said awkward. Maybe I'm wrong. But anyway, it is awkward. But, you know, so that's a reality. Elections matter. You know, agencies change. But it really hasn't been something that I've personally seen any changes at the EEOC.
So the report, again, focuses on that behavior that's not obviously illegal, and so the gray area behavior. Does your focus on that suggest that you might want to widen our understanding of harassment as a legal matter?
Well, the report took no position on that at all. And I certainly can't speak for the EOC. That's the point. I'm one commissioner. I will say this, though, because there are a lot of suggestions by different advocacy groups on changing some of the legal standards. I guess what I'm a bit more focused on, and I sort of alluded to it, is changing how judges apply the existing legal standard, right? So I can describe a set of 3 things that happen to someone: a woman, a black person, a person with a disability, right? And some of us would say, oh my God, that's horrible. You know, that's consistent enough, those 3 things, and they're yicky enough that even though they're not, let's say, severe, they definitely create a hostile work environment. I assure you, you and I would be like in sync on some things, and some judge might not. And I think as we start to change the culture, and we change the cultural understanding of what's okay and what's not, even without ever changing the standard, I think we could try to change the legal outcome. The second place where I think you don't necessarily have to change the standard, but you can make change is, remember I said before, a defense is that you took effective preventive measures. Well, what if we started changing the understanding of what is an effective preventive measure? And instead of it just being that you did some training, if some companies start doing a panoply of activities, they do a proactive look at their risk factors. They do a survey of their workforce, both, anonymous survey, focus groups. They have a strategic plan about how to change culture. They have bystander intervention training, right? If you start changing what a lot of companies are doing, I think you change the norm of what could be effective, reasonable preventive measures. Now, that's a long-term process. But let me tell you, it's a long-term process to get any changes through Congress, as someone who worked for 20 years with Congress. So they're both long-term, right, in terms of changing the legal standard.
Could you get more traction if you also changed the composition of the judiciary?
I choose not to answer that question. Is Chris Ofer in this room, by the way, like he said he would be? There he is. Chris Ofer works for Bloomberg, BNA, Labor. Everyone reads him. I don't think you should mention my politically incorrect thing, because it's, because it's the first time I've said it. It's just, just like I had this reaction. Anyway.
All right, now I'm nervous. Okay.
So long as you never want to be up for Senate confirmation, Professor Murray, I think you don't have to worry.
I wrote a paper called Marriage is Punishment. No one's appointed me to anything. Okay. All right.
Yeah, and I wrote a piece calling "Gay is Good," which is, causing some problems.
We're gonna be in the back of the hearings. Like we're never gonna be up front. Okay.
Well, no, I have been up front.
The next set will be in the back. Okay. So here are some questions about the broader, more abstract project of changing workplace culture. You've talked a lot about what leaders can do, so top-level management and how they can change culture. What can people who are at the bottom do to change culture?
Great question, whoever asked it. And hopefully a bunch of you also thinking it, because it has to come from both directions. That is the point of bystander intervention, right? Bystander intervention training starts with reinforcing a sense of collective responsibility, okay? And people do not like seeing harassment happening around them, even if it's not happening to them. Either they feel it's not their problem, or they feel they just don't know what to do. They don't know what to do. And they're afraid if they do anything, they'll be the next target of the harassment. So it's like folks at the bottom and all the way through. Folks at the bottom, you're presumably working with other folks that in the power hierarchy are at the bottom. So it's got to be some way in which you are told by the top leadership that if you intervene, if you help someone who is being harassed, you will be supported and applauded by your leadership. So it's got to be at every level, because those are the people who are going to see what's going on. The other way in which I think it can go from bottom up, I would hope that leaders would decide to offer bystander intervention training and to say this is important. But you know what? I see no reason why 15 employees in some organization can't write a letter to the leadership saying, we would like to get bystander intervention training. You know, these are skills we don't have. We want to have it.
I think I like that you frame it as a set of skills. Like these aren't things that we necessarily come to inevitably, but that we actually have to be trained to do this.
In fact, not only we don't come to it inevitably, there's all these reasons not to want to do it, right? So the person who we actually paid for someone, Fran Sepler, to develop respectful workplaces training that the EOC would offer. And there's separate training for employees and for supervisors. Because supervisors need sort of additional skills when someone comes to them with a report of harassment, you know, how to respond, not to trivialize, not to dismiss it, not to blame the person. And so Fran talks about the fact that, you know, what do you do when you get a gift that you don't like? I'm sure that hasn't happened to anyone in this room. But if you got a present you didn't like, what do you say? Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm sure I can use this, right? Maybe if you've gotten some skills, you say that. But her point, and this is really important, supervisors, HR people, they have to be trained when someone comes with a report of harassment to say, thank you. Thank you for coming forward. If what you say is happening, it is wrong, and we will stop it. And here's what will happen next. Okay, it's not a automatic assumption that what the person has come and said is true. That's why you have an investigation, a full and fair one. But that takes the person seriously. Now, how many HR people do you think would want to ordinarily say when you come with a complaint, thank you? No, it's not instinctive. But they have to be told by their leaders, we want you to say thank you, and then thank you for coming forward. It lets us have a chance to fix this, and we'll have your back when you say that, even when someone comes to you about a superstar harasser. Because no one wants to start the ball rolling on that. No one wants to say thank you about that. And yet, they have to be told, we will support you when you say thank you.
So about the superstar, if you're someone on the bottom and you observe the superstar doing something that would be objectionable or harassing to another person, can you be an effective bystander? Because the superstar really does put you in a position of fear.
Right, which is why organizations, for-profit, nonprofit, have to have multiple forms of reporting. So, I mean, there's so much we can do. It's like, I feel like we're at a baby industry and we can just grow in terms of creative ideas. You know, so there are apps. Now, we had someone, and any of you want more about this, you just Google EOC harassment report, and you will get not only the report, but you'll come to a page with all the people who testified, you know, their information that they gave. So we had one person testify about an app where it was just a third-party ombuds, like totally separate from the organization, who could then at least give some suggestions, right? There's another one, and this is just on sexual harassment, so I think it has to be broader, where you can go and report just completely anonymously, and then if someone else reports about the same person, they'll put you in touch with that person in case you feel, okay, with 2 I feel safer, with 5 I might feel even safer. And then they can also have an agreement with the company. If you get a few completely anonymously about someone, the company, the organization finds out, but not knowing who reported, can then go to that division, start talking to people in that division, to the whole 15 people, right? It's just giving us a way to get out ahead of it, because people are afraid of coming forward because of retaliation, and they're not wrong to be afraid. Okay, right now, they are not wrong to be afraid. The surveys we looked at showed that if people did report, about 50% of them got retaliated against. So if you see that happen to someone else, why would you come forward, superstar or otherwise? Can you imagine if 5 years from now, there was a nationally representative survey and that number plummeted of the number of people who had been retaliated against? It's not going to be zero, I assure you. But just a plummeting number would be incredible, which is, by the way, the other group that needs to be held accountable. Remember I said leaders have to take actions that employees think they're authentic? Anyone who engages in retaliation of any kind, professional or social, against someone who reported harassment or corroborated harassment as a witness has to be held accountable for that retaliation. And let me tell you, that will put the fear into others not to retaliate.
So, what do you, is this kind of cultural change something that we can do in our lifetimes? I mean, for some, this might be really ingrained behavior. I think it's part of a sexual culture that conditions women to respond in particular ways and conditions men in ways that I think are quite antithetical. How are we ever going to get to a shared understanding of appropriate behavior, whether it's appropriate workplace conduct or appropriate sexual behavior?
Right.
How are we going to get there?
Right, and we have racist views ingrained in us, we have disability views, I mean, they're all ingrained, right? So, you say in your lifetime, I started doing first, obviously, lesbian gay work, then gender identity, as a lesbian, came out in the 80s, I assure you, I did not think I would see what I see in my lifetime, right? So, and what's interesting in terms of LGBT rights is we have come culturally further than we have come legally in terms of one of the ENDA that I drafted in 1992, right, with various folks. And then over the years worked on, well, you know what? Legally, we now have more protection because of the EOC's work saying that sexual orientation and gender identity are forms of sex discrimination. And as I often said about that, cultural logic had to change before legal logic could catch up. Because legally, of course, it's a form of sex discrimination if you discriminate against an LGBT person. What else is going on but taking into account sex? And the sex of the person you're involved with, the sex that you identify with. Culture had to change. Law and culture worked together. So in our lifetime, will we see a change? I don't know, but I get up every day thinking it can be, so let's work on it. And it's like the waves, right? The waves of feminism, the waves of understanding how racism is still so deep and what can we do to fight it. The waves of how people with disabilities have, the views of society have changed. So this is the moment. If there is a moment to leverage to do those structural changes, this is it, which is why it's so important not to just do it on sex for me. Whether it takes or not, I don't know. But I just have to believe that there's a chance.
So if the Me Too movement has opened up a moment, are there ways in which the movement itself might be critiqued? Are there things that it could do better to take advantage of this moment? Or do you think it's business as usual and it's fine the way it's proceeding? Like some people have criticized the use of shame, the idea of zero tolerance policies, the immediate expulsion of harassers, and even things that we might not necessarily categorize as harassment as a legal matter, but sort of that gray area conduct, the immediate expulsion of those engaged in that kind of conduct. Does it go too far? Are there things that could be done better? Or is the movement valuable simply for having opened up a moment?
Right. A, the movement is valuable. B, I sort of don't feel like I'm in it enough to speak. I mean, it's such a diffuse movement. I do have strong positions on zero tolerance and immediate expulsion, which is it's got to be proportionate. I don't like the word zero tolerance. And the report says we don't like the word zero tolerance for this reason. We love the idea of communicating there will be no tolerance for any unwelcome conduct, okay? No matter how low level, no tolerance. But often it's experienced by employees as meaning there will be the same response to every form of misconduct. firing the person. Now, that will not only be correctly perceived as an unfair system, it can also chill reporting. Because often the person doesn't want the coworker fired, they just want the conduct to stop. So it has to be proportionate response. Now, sometimes proportionate response is immediate expulsion, you know, depending on the facts. And again, immediate after an investigation. That's why, again, I understand the piece of saying, always believe the victim. And I think we need that more nuanced. To me, it's never dismiss what the victim is saying. You know, don't trivialize, don't dismiss it, don't say, well, let's talk about what you were doing in this interaction, you know, the blame game. No, take the person seriously, but we have to have a stronger commitment to the fair investigation and the proportionate discipline. But let me tell you, I don't think I would tell someone who's telling her story under Me Too that she has to think about all these things. She's telling her story. Or he's telling his story. Let's get that story out. But those of us who are involved in structural changes should be taking that power, that moment, and making sure that we're doing the right things, including things like proportionality. I'm not sure I have anything to say about shaming. What do you have to say about
What do I
shaming?
have to say about shaming? I was ashamed when you told me your response when people give you a gift that you don't like, because when I get a gift like that, I never know what to say, and I'm always like, oh, wow.
Oh,
This.
Melissa, I'm not saying that is what I say, okay? I can't tell you the number of times that my girlfriend, now spouse, has given me something, and I'm like, oh.
Wow.
Wow. The only way that she knows there's the difference is when I open up something like, oh my God, this is great. So then she can tell the difference. But no, of course it's hard, and I'm not saying that I do it at all. But I feel we can be taught.
So, like, we can always do better.
Right.
That's a powerful message. We are always striving toward a better place, a better position, a more perfect union, as it were.
Yes. And we have to be compassionate with ourselves, you know, which, by the way, was something that took me about many years to learn, because I would make a mistake and all I would do was berate myself, you know? And then finally, with help, I was taught, you know what? Sometimes you made that mistake or you reacted in a certain way because of other things that we are. And just have some compassion for yourself. And just be curious about why you did it, and then figure out how you might want to do it differently. So again, if you say a comment to someone, look, if you're not in the disability culture, I assure you, you may not know that something you said was just did not feel good to that person, you know? So it's about the person with the disability, or whatever it is, being able to say, that didn't feel good because. Mm-hmm. And then for the person who hears that, to sort of have some compassion for themselves. Wow, I guess I just wasn't ever taught that or thought about that. And then that's going to be a positive exchange on both sides. Now, this isn't something that deals with the power dynamics that cause sexual assault, okay? You know, there's a spectrum. Mm-hmm. But
it could. I mean, the idea of being able to sort of speak up to someone who is in a different power relationship to you, like to feel empowered enough that you can raise your concerns.
Right.
And we talk about this with kids all the time. You know, when my kids go to school, they're always told, you know, if someone interrupts you, you can say, like, you really hurt me because you stepped on my words, or something like that.
Yes.
And they're always telling them to say it, and somehow along the way we lose that.
Along the way. Because of the power dynamics.
Yeah.
You know, you can say that to someone else in third grade, who's also in third grade with you.
You can say that to your mother. You don't
and
care
you
about
can
the power
certainly
dynamics.
Well, sometimes the power dynamics seem switched on that. But anyway, but, you know, in a workplace, you know, this is why being proactive and making the distinction between what's appropriate management, right? Yeah, you need hierarchy sometimes to get things done. But hierarchy doesn't mean that the person who's subordinate gets to be humiliated on any basis, and certainly not harassed on a protected basis.
And we might all think of ourselves, regardless of our position, as sort of managers of a sort, like either managers of this situation or manager. Like professors don't really work for anyone. I mean, nominally we work for the university, but we're sort of independent contractors, if you will. But I've been thinking about working with my RAs or working with students, and like I do have a managerial responsibility and role, thinking about how to do that. I think when you get in that mindset, it sort of opens up a lot of different ways of thinking about the interactions you have with people that reveal new kinds of ways of being.
I think that's exactly right. It's about relationships, and I certainly felt that I was working for my students, when I was teaching, and I think probably more so when I was running the clinic, because I ran a legislation clinic. You got 12 students, and I remember saying to them in the beginning, you will never again be doing a project for someone who is paid to care about your education and your learning. You'll be an associate or public interest lawyer. I'm being paid to help you, right? But it's very hard to hold on to that when there is that power dynamic. And I think often I just didn't have patience. And I would say things, and we are all constantly learning.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you, Hai, for getting paid to help all of us. Thank you. This is a really fascinating conversation. The work that you're doing at the EEOC is so important, and we're so glad you came to share it with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.